Well then, there are many things in life that I believe we can all agree on. One thing I'm sure that is not controversial that we can agree on is music plays a large part in our memory. Almost all of us can hear a piece of music, some popular music, rock and roll, jazz, country, whatever. An old record that was in what they used to call the hit parade, and it will take us back, and we'll have a personal memory that relates to that. And I think most people have got a song or a group of songs or a number of songs or that will take them back to a period in their life. And it's constant. These sort of things are quite strange, really, because once you have an association with something in your brain, it stays there. And I mean, this is a method of learning or retaining names or doing whatever. People think of an association with something, associate two things together, and it reminds them of something, and they remember things. There's also words in the English language that it's strange. I don't think whether this is true or not, but to me it seems that these words have a sound to them that explains their meaning without even understanding the meaning. And one word that comes to my mind in this particular topic is the word nerd, N-E-R-D. Now, I'm not sure if this is a word that is used in the United States, but in England it certainly is a word, nerd or nerdy. And it describes a person who's, I guess, introverted into some strange or unusual, or is intensely involved in some subject or topic or hobby. And it kind of describes me, I suppose, when it comes to what I have in my mind and I'm associated with things. And it's to do with cars, of course. And so, as a bit of an exercise, I've just picked up a copy of a classic car, a sort of newspaper. It comes out every week. And just flip through it. And there's pictures of cars, old cars, classic cars, if you like. And so many of them hold memories to me. And these are memories. I don't mean these are things I suddenly think of. These are memories which I think are fixed in my mind. So when I see these particular cars, I have memories that it's the same memory that I recall. So I associate this particular memory with this car. So I've just scanned a few of these pictures, and I'll just go through them and maybe give you an idea. And I'm sure those who are interested in cars will be able to do the same thing. You know, they could even, maybe some of the pictures of cars that I've got here, you'll have the memories of your own to do with those cars, and perhaps it's cars that you've owned before, or something that happened in your life that involved that particular car. So let's have a look. Here we are. Right, so the first picture that I've pulled out of the magazine is of a Ford Mustang convertible from the mid-60s. And the reason is that one day I was driving along somewhere, I don't know, in South London, I think, and I saw a forecourt with a Ford Mustang like this, convertible on the forecourt. So I pulled over, stopped, walked back, and had a look at it. It was red with a black interior. I thought, I really like this car. This is what I'd like to have. So obviously it wasn't long before a salesman came over and started talking to me. And I said, look, I'm kind of interested in this, but I'd like to trade in another American car. And he said, well, what have you got? And I said, well, I've got a 1978 Cadillac Seville. I said, it's immaculate, but I'd like to trade it in as part exchange for this Mustang. And I was appalled. The guy said, I'm not interested. He didn't want the Cadillac. He said, no. He said, I'm not. I wouldn't take that as a part exchange. I said, oh, fine. I was really miffed is the word, actually, miffed. I mean, and I just drove away. But I always remember that incident because whenever I see a Mustang like this, especially a convertible, I think I could have had one of those, and that was the closest I ever came to owning one. So I always remember that time. And yeah, this is the actual car that I had, this Cadillac. I mean, I've got lots of pictures of it. It's an absolutely beautiful car. You know, another one of those you think, why did you sell it? Well, actually, I sold it because I needed the money to finance a car that I'd bought from a company in the UK called Luxury and Power, I think they were called. And this was back in, the very early 80s. And they were importing cars from the United States. And this was well before internet, obviously, and things like that. You know, we couldn't do the things internationally with the cars that we do now, buying and selling, that is. We didn't have eBay and all this sort of stuff. Anyway, I went to this dealer who imported American cars, Luxury and Power, I think that's what they were called. Anyway, they had this Lincoln Premier 1957. I had pictures of it. It looked good. They gave me a story about it, that it was so good. And it turned out the car, well, I'm not going to go into the full story really, but the car was basically a scrap. I think they stopped cars at the scrap yard before they were being delivered to be crushed, and they took them away for a few dollars, and then they sold them to people like me in the UK. But eventually, after a number of years, I did restore the car, and I fell in love with it, and here it is. Yeah, and you can see how much in love with it I was when I'd finally finished it. But I even forget what happened to the car. I didn't get it on the road fully, because even though I finally managed to get it completed, there were still issues with it, and it was very difficult in those days to get a lot of the parts. I used to have to phone. In fact, I used to phone a place called Lincoln Land, and they were a bit of a scrap dealer in Florida, I think, who specialized in parts for Lincolns. And you had to phone them in the middle of the night so that they were awake in Florida, and ask them if they had a certain part or certain bit that you wanted. And then you'd arrange to send some money transfer to them. And when they got the money transfer, you'd hear from them by mail, and then they would eventually send the part. It took weeks to get parts, and then you weren't 100% certain that it was the right bit. So it was a long, drawn-out business, not like it is now with eBay and everything, and just, instantly you can get parts from the States quite easily now, but in those days it was very difficult. Unless, of course, you went through a dealer. And then, of course, the point about going through a dealer was, there again, it took longer, it cost money, and more money, and also because you had a third party involved in the discussions or the transactions, you didn't always get the part that you wanted. And because if it was a fairly obscure part for an obscure car, if you like, you were relying on somebody translating your information to somebody else across the Atlantic. Anyway, that was the Lincoln, and that's the car that I think about, that Cadillac, when I think about the Mustang. That's a bit involved, isn't it? Right, well, this is a Woolsey 1500, or what was more common that reminds me really was the Riley version, which was the Riley 1.5. Basically the same car. I think they had the same engine. I'm pretty sure of that, but anyway, just a bit of badge trimming difference, I think. Anyway, these were the cars that a couple of guys that I knew had in the early 60s, and in those days there was a bit of a famous race from Brighton. Cars would kind of meet up on usually a Saturday night at near the seafront in Brighton, near the Palace Pier, and there'd be a sort of an unofficial road race to a cafe. It wasn't not the Ace Cafe, but there was another cafe. I can't remember the name. Somewhere in South London, I think it was near Streatham, perhaps. And we used to drive there in the dark. But of course, in those days, the M23 did not exist. No motorways were around in that part of the country. And we used to drive through Crawley near Gatwick Airport. And at that point, there were sort of a bypass, and there were a large number of roundabouts, fairly new. They were fairly new roundabouts. And we used to race these cars, but the car that suddenly was really doing well were the new Minis. They had only just come out a few years before, and some guys had these new Minis. And of course, when they got to the roundabouts, the Minis just shot round, and that made a big difference, because the older cars, that like the Rileys and the Wolseys, they had to really slow down at these roundabouts. So in the end, we decided that we'd give it a try, because the roundabouts were basically just domed, great big roundabouts, but they were covered in grass in those days. They hadn't grown any plants or trees on them, they were just grass. And of course, the Wolseys had a fairly soft suspension and big tires. So we discovered that we could just drive these cars straight across the roundabout instead of going round them. And that actually was quicker than the Minis even. So that was the history of that. Right, well, this Vauxhall, it isn't a car that I had. And the only reason that I pulled it out was because every time I see this Vauxhall, I was always impressed at how much it was, the design of it was similar or based upon an American car, basically the Chevy, the early 50s, 1949, 1950 Chevy. And it always reminded me at the time, because these were English cars, the Vauxhall, but whenever I saw one in the street, and they stood out because at that time in the 50s, still, the majority of the cars were black, old pre-war cars, and the Vauxhall was so new, and it reminded me of my childhood in Canada. So I was always sort of felt a bit nostalgic when I saw one of these coming down the road, and I still have that sort of feeling now when I look at it. Right, well, the Rover, actually this is this Rover 2000, so it's not really the one, but the V8 version and a more luxurious version was one I always fancied. And when I worked in a textile company once, I had company cars, but one of the directors, he had a Rover like this, and I always envied it, and I knew that I wouldn't get one because I was not that high up the ladder, at that time anyway. I had a Datsun, which was a nice car because I had the top of the range of the Datsuns. I'll talk about it in another video. But this car always reminded. So whenever I see a Rover, I always think of those days when I wanted one, but I wasn't able to afford one, and I wasn't going to get one in my job. Right. Well, whenever I see one of these Sunbeam Talbots. That takes me back to the mid-50s, really. And a friend of mine, who I was very close friend with at that time, his father had one. Actually, this is the one he had, and a picture of it. And I absolutely love the car. I don't know why. It just had such beautiful shape. It seemed to be much different to anything that was around at that time. And he used to drive this car. His father drove the car with him. They went on holiday to Spain, I think, in it. And I was so impressed. I just imagined the pleasure, the joy of driving in this car to Spain from England. Absolutely wonderful. But of course, you know, when you look at a car like this and its design, you have to really, if you weren't around then, you have to imagine the impact that this design had in that period and the other cars that were around, because, you know, anything from, if it was 1955 or 1956 that I'm talking about, you have to take all the cars that were launched after 56 and scrap them, forget about them, because it was only cars that were up to that point that you compared this with. And it's very difficult to do that. It's the same with anything, to go back in time. But certainly this car was, to me, very impressionable for the time. Right, well, this is a Ford Zodiac, and again, it's not a car that I've actually ever owned, but it's a car that was around a lot when I was first working in an art studio in the early 60s, and I was very much into design and the evolving design trends of the day. And this car and the console versions of it, the Zephyr version of it, were again at the time very modern. They were a big advancement, and the design values of the shape and the balance between the aspects of the car in design terms was really, I thought, very modern. And the Zodiac was also a major improvement on the Zephyr and console versions. And I remember being always looking at them and thinking how much better the Zodiac was, how they'd improved it with the extra trim, and this, the design of the grille was more comprehensive, obviously, and so on, and the trim, in terms of wheel trims and everything, and it always made an impression. And whenever I see one of these now, I always think back at those days and how I was impressed with it from a design point of view, really, not just as a car. Right, well, here's a jolly little picture of a lovely little Austin 7 in one of its many variations, incarnations. Again, not a car that I've ever owned, not particularly a car that I've ever wanted to own, though in later years now I can understand, obviously, anyone who wanted one or has one, and maybe the charm of it and the enjoyment of it is similar to that of owning a 2CV. But I never had one, though they actually bring back the same sort of memory for me, and it's like this next picture here, this one, of the interior. It's a type of car which has got, you can smell the interior, that very thick leather, and the leather straps where the doors open and they would creak, and you can just imagine the sounds from this car, the sort of solid brass looking metal, and the really coach built, even though it's just a tiny little Austin 7. It was from an era of really solid old-fashioned materials, and a real link between hand-built, coach-built vehicles and the modern cars, which are all simply plastic and creaking plastic, whereas this was creaking leather. And also it had a tactile feel which vinyl didn't really give you. Anyway, I've always been attracted to this sort of look, and the little Austin 7 seemed to have it in spades. Well, this car is just brings back memories of the one that I bought, which was the same car, not slightly darker red, and it turned out to be a total disaster. It was one of the, or probably the only time I bought a car on eBay or unseen. Bought it from a description and from photographs, and I've done it many, many times, and it's always been successful. But this was the one time it was not, and the man I bought it off, I then subsequently discovered was a bit of a con man. He'd been a con man in other areas, not just cars. He was apparently quite renowned as a con man, and he did a good job. He conned me, and so whenever I see these Daimlers, and even the Mark II Jag, I can't help but think about that. Well, these Jags, they were, again, a lovely car, and not a car that I ever really wanted to have. It was never a car that I could ever imagine owning, cost-wise. But always reminds me, takes me back to the 50s, 1950s, when we lived in a house in Brighton, and the person, we rented a part of the house, and the house was sold. Well, actually, the house today, the house today would probably be worth £1.5 million, maybe. It's on the seafront in Brighton, Kemp Town. And at the time, we were renting the whole house. It was on about 4 or 5 floors. And we sublet a couple of rooms, actually, but it was such a big house. This was in the middle 50s to late 50s. And the man who owned it was selling it, and he offered it to us for £2,500, which at the time I suppose was a lot of, a fair price, I don't know. But we couldn't afford it. We couldn't afford it at all. So it was sold to somebody else, a solicitor in London, and he allowed us to continue renting part of the house, and he used the rest of the house as a sort of holiday home. He'd come down from London to stay in Brighton for an odd weekend, but he had one of these Jags, and he used to turn up on a Friday night or a Saturday morning, and with his wife and kids, and in this Jag. And I always remember that from seeing one of these. Now here again, this MG YB is not a car that I've ever owned, or even come close to owning, but it's a car. It's a bit of a rarity, because I don't think there's many of these about. It's not what you really immediately think of when you think of MG. You think of pure sort of sports cars, open-top sports car, but these saloons I really like. I don't know why. They're a bit like the Sunbeam Toll, but they just have a sort of image about them and a design uniqueness that I just found fabulous, and I would just love to have one of these. To me, they're a standout car in terms of design and, to me, desirability. Right, well, this is a car that brings back, well, two memories, really, two distinct memories. So we've got a Ford Capri. I've got two strong memories of Ford Capris. Again, not a car that I've ever owned, not actually a car that I've ever really wanted to own. But when they first were launched back in, I think, 1969, I worked at a company, and one of the directors, a woman, she actually bought one. She bought it brand new, obviously, when it was first launched, and had it delivered, and she'd only had it a couple of days. And I remember one evening, 3 or 4 of us went round to her apartment in Brighton. She had in a block of flats, and she said she'd get the car out and take us for a drive. I mean, we were all enthralled with this because this car was launched with a lot of publicity in it. Everyone to actually see one and to actually be able to go out in one was a big thrill. And I remember she was white, and she brought it up this slope from the parking area underneath this block of flats where she lived, and parked it, stopped it, and we all got in. And then we said, right, we're all going for a ride. And I was sitting in the back, I remember. A bit cramped, but I was in the back. And the car wouldn't start. She couldn't get it to go. I don't know what was wrong. But I remember we had to all basically push the car back into the car parking area, which was a nightmare because she wanted it back there inside. And of course it was a slope down the hill, so she was braking and we were pushing, and there was no engine running. Anyway, that was one memory. But the other memory, which was even, I suppose, greater, really, was a friend of mine, a guy I knew. He had one of these in South London. I won't say who he is or where he lived, but he was in South London. And I think it went wrong. This would have been back in, when would this be? This would have been back in the, maybe 20 years ago. And he decided to take it out to Streatham Park, or Streatham Green, or whatever it was, and set fire to it. And then he reported it stolen. Well, the car was eventually found, obviously burnt out, and he got his insurance money from it, which was cheaper than getting it fixed. So, anyway, right. Well, this is a Vauxhall Viva, and there again, these were very avant-garde in terms of design when they came out. Very much so. I was, again, very impressed with these Vauxhall Vivas. Well, so was I with the previous model, which was a little boxy one. But they were spot on as far as the design trends were concerned at the time. But anyway, my ex-father-in-law had one of these, and it was his pride and joy at the time. It was a lovely car, and whenever I see one of these, takes me back to those times when he was my father-in-law, and different time of life. Yeah, a lot of memory associated with this vehicle. Right, well, this was a funny thing. There again, I think to explain this, you really have to put yourself back in time. And in the middle 50s, I came from Canada to live in England, and I remember being quite shocked, if you like, by the design of the cars that were in England, because they were to me, very old-fashioned. They were, mainly old black Morrises and big black cars, and not like the cars that I was used to in Canada when I'd left, which was the early 50s, and they were all the cars that were sort of look fairly modern then. Anyway, this car reminds me that where we were living in some flats and apartments, and the one below us, I think it was below us anyway, there was a nurse, and she had one of these, and she used to go to work in it and everything, and I was impressed because this little car at the time was so modern. I thought this was a really modern car. I remember thinking, my God, this is a really great little car, and I loved it because it was modern. It's like a scaled down version of an American car at the time, and I always associate her, this nurse, in her uniform. She used to go off in her nursing uniform, which nurses don't really wear now, but she had this lovely uniform, starched collars and stiff dresses with aprons and everything. Anyway, she went off in this little car to work every day, and I used to see her, and I was so impressed with her and the car. Right, well, this memory is a bit more recent for this car. This is the Jensen Interceptor. Now, there was a Jensen Interceptor in blue, metallic blue, that sat outside Bennett's Motors for years, belonged to Nick, one of the owners, and had a lovely cream interior. And I always wanted to buy the car. He was always threatening to restore it. It was waiting to be restored. It was one of the vehicles that he'd sort of bought and kept outside, never kept it under cover. He kept it outside, and I guess it was deteriorating. But I always wanted to buy it off him. But he would never sell it. He'd never sell it. In the end, he did sell it, not to me, but he just got rid of it. And I suppose the truth is what he said. He wouldn't sell it to me because he knew there was so much wrong with it, and he didn't want me to have it. And then, I kind of would blame him for all the cost and the work involved. But I was always a bit annoyed because I always wanted a Jensen Interceptor, and this was probably the nearest. It was the nearest I ever got to owning one, and I didn't get it. Right, well, this is a quite a poignant and interesting car to me. It's a Renault 16. I can honestly say one of my all-time favourite cars. I had two of them actually, but mainly one in blue, and the story behind it is that I ran a textile business of my own at one time, which I started up, and I had a factory in Derby, which I was renting, and the owner of the actual building, I used to go up and see him, and he had a blue Renault 16 sitting outside the building, and I asked him about it, and he said, well, it'd been sitting there for, I think somebody owed him money and left the car there, and that was it. It'd been sitting there for a couple of years, he said. And he said to me one day, well, you can have the car if you want it. So the next time I went up there, I went up on the train, and I drove the car back. Well, the car, we'd had it going, so I knew it would drive. And I was driving it back to Brighton from Derby, and of course where it had been sitting, I guess, the tyre had sort of rotted away underneath at one point. So I was going down the motorway towards London, I remember, and tyre burst. In fact, if I remember rightly, I was on the outside lane trying to see how fast the car would go, probably. And I ended up on the hard shoulder anyway. And in those days there was no motor, we didn't have any phones or anything, obviously, and you had to sort of either wait till somebody came along and stopped, or you would walk along to find one of these phones and phone for assistance. But actually I looked down, and down off the motorway there was a sort of hill going down to the side, and at the bottom I saw a garage. So I jumped over the barrier and sort of trotted down the hill, went into the garage, and managed to persuade they didn't have a recovery vehicle, so but I managed to persuade them to climb up the hill with me with some material, I don't know what we did, but we jacked the car up. They took the wheel off and changed the spare for me. I think it was because I probably didn't have there was nothing in the car to take the wheel off. And also I think that we needed air in the tyre, so they had a pump and everything. That's basically what the problem was, I think. Anyway, my version to this thing, there's a picture of me with the car. So there's me with my car. So yeah, lovely car. I thought it was really great. I don't know why I had the second one, but the one I had was I think it was a column change automatic. So it was automatic, but with the column change. Beautiful car, I thought. Right, so this is in MGB GT, and my memory of this car, which I always think about, was at the period when they were first launched, or at least they were fairly new. I was had a crowd of friends in Brighton. A number of them were fairly wealthy, or at least their parents were. And one of them was given one of these MGB GTs for his 21st birthday. God, was I impressed and jealous, envious. In later years, I actually bought one, a green one, and I was very unimpressed with it. It sounded great, and it was you felt good driving it at the time. This would be in the early 70s, but it was very slow. And I think the car I'd had before it was this Datsun, which was quite a light car and quite fast for what it was. But this MG I found it very sluggish, and I didn't keep it for very long. And it was very impractical, very impractical. Very small, and it really didn't suit me at the time. Anyway, but my biggest memory is some guy I knew getting one of these for his 21st birthday. My God.